I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there in my kitchen holding a dish towel, staring at the wall, thinking, I'm 64 years old. I live in a small house in Sudbury, Ontario, the same house I've lived in for 31 years. The backyard still has the garden my husband planted before he passed. The kitchen still smells like the same dish soap I've been buying since 1998. And until 8 months ago, I thought the hardest chapter of my life was already behind me. I was wrong. My son's name is Liam. He's 23 now. And this is the story of what happened to him, what happened to us, and what happened the morning a woman I hadn't seen in 11 years walked back through a door she had no right to open. I need to go back to the beginning for any of this to make sense. Liam came to live with me when he was 4 years old. My daughter Renata, she was 22 at the time, barely out of her teenage years in any real sense. She showed up at my door on a Thursday evening in October with him on her hip and a garbage bag full of his clothes over her shoulder. She said she needed a break. She said she was overwhelmed. She said she'd be back in a few days. I want to be honest with you, because that's the only reason I'm telling this story at all. When she said those things, I believed her. I did. Renata had always been impulsive, always been someone who moved toward the exit when things got hard, but she was my daughter. I thought I knew her limits. I thought she loved him enough. She didn't come back in a few days. She didn't come back in a few weeks. I got a text message 6 weeks later that said, "He's better with you. I need to figure my life out. I'm sorry." That was it. That was all I got. Now I need you to understand something about Liam. When he came to live with me, he had already been flagged by a developmental specialist in Sault Ste. Marie, where Renata had been living at the time, for what they suspected was autism. The formal diagnosis came 4 months after he moved in with me. Level 2, they said. Needs substantial support. I was 61 when he was diagnosed, a retired school secretary, a widow, and suddenly I was the primary caregiver for a 4-year-old with significant sensory sensitivities, communication delays, and a profound, almost breathtaking ability to fixate on things that most people would never even notice. The first thing Liam fixated on was calendars, not the pictures on them, the structure, the grid. He would sit at the kitchen table and stare at the page, not blankly, not absently, but with the kind of focused intensity that made you feel like you were watching someone read a language you didn't speak. He started copying them out by hand when he was 5. Then he started making his own. Then he started adding things to them, small notations, little symbols he'd invented himself. His occupational therapist in Sudbury told me this was called systemizing. She said some autistic children have an extraordinary ability to find and map patterns in structured information. She said to encourage it, so I did. I bought him graph paper. I bought him colored pens. I drove him 40 minutes each way to a specialized program in Greater Sudbury 3 times a week, and I sat in the waiting room with my crossword puzzles and my coffee, and I waited. Every time. Renata called maybe 4 times over the next 2 years. The calls were short. She always sounded like she was in a hurry to be somewhere else. She asked if Liam was okay. I told her he was. She never asked what okay meant. She never asked what he was working on, what he was interested in, what made him laugh. She would say, "Okay, good," and then she'd say she had to go, and then she'd go. After the 4th call, she stopped calling. I applied for legal guardianship when Liam was 6. It took 14 months and cost me nearly $9,000 in legal fees. I borrowed some of it from my sister-in-law in Timmins and paid her back over 3 years. Renata did not contest it. She signed the paperwork by courier without a single phone call to me or to Liam's caseworker. I want to be careful here because I'm not telling you this to make you hate her. Hating people is exhausting, and I've never had the energy for it. I'm telling you this because you need to understand what the next 11 years actually looked like. 11 years of school meetings where I sat alone on one side of a table while a team of specialists talked about my grandson's IEP. 11 years of meltdowns in grocery stores and pharmacies, and once memorably in the parking lot of a Canadian Tire in November where Liam lay down on the pavement in -15 and refused to move because the sound of the shopping cart wheels on the asphalt was, in his words, wrong in a specific way. I sat down on the pavement beside him. We stayed there for 20 minutes. Then we went home. 11 years of learning alongside him how his brain worked, how he needed warnings before transitions, how he couldn't tolerate certain textures, the seams in socks, anything with a hood that touched the back of his neck, how he could tell you the day of the week for any date you gave him forward or backward in under 3 seconds and be right every single time. That last part, that was the thing that started everything. Liam discovered programming when he was 12. It started, like most things with Liam, with a very specific problem. He had been tracking his own sensory data, when he felt overwhelmed, what the triggers were, how long recovery took, in a series of handmade notebooks he kept in a box under his bed. One evening, he came to me and said very seriously that the notebooks were becoming inefficient. He said he needed a better system. I did not fully understand what happened over the next 2 years. I want to be honest about that. I'm a woman who learned to use email at 53 and still calls the internet the computer. But I could see that Liam was building something. He sat at the second-hand laptop I'd bought him from a refurbished electronics store on La Sala Boulevard, and he worked. He worked every evening after dinner. He worked on weekends. He worked with the same quiet, total concentration he'd always had, and slowly, over months, over years, something took shape. He was 14 when he showed it to me for the first time. A sensory tracking and pattern analysis tool built specifically for autistic individuals and their caregivers. It logged inputs, it identified patterns, it sent gentle, customizable alerts. It communicated in whatever format worked best for the user. Visual, text, sound, any combination. I sat beside him while he walked me through it. I nodded along, I asked questions I'm sure were too simple, and then I said, "Liam, this is extraordinary." He said, "I know, I've been testing it for 7 months and the data is very good." He was 14, he talked like that. His support worker at the time, a young man from Chelmsford who had been working with Liam for 3 years, connected us with the tech incubator program out of Laurentian University. I drove Liam to his first meeting there in February. He was 15. He sat across from 3 adults who worked in technology and explained his app to them for 40 minutes without notes. They asked him questions. He answered all of them. On the drive home, he said, "I think that went well." I said, "I think so too." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Grandma, do you think my mother ever thinks about me?" I kept my eyes on the highway. The snow was coming down sideways the way it does up here, the kind that makes the road disappear in front of you for a second or two at a time. I said, "I think she thinks about you in her own way." He said, "Okay," and then he looked out the window for the rest of the drive, and we didn't talk about it again. Liam turned 16 in March. By September of that year, his app had been acquired by a health technology company based in Waterloo for just over $2.8 million. There was also a licensing arrangement that added recurring royalty income. The total value of the deal, according to the lawyer who helped us structure it, a specialist in intellectual property who came recommended through the university program, came to approximately $3.4 million. I'm not going to pretend I fully understood every document I signed, but I understood enough, and more importantly, I had people around me who made sure Liam's interests were protected. A trust was established in his name. Everything was handled carefully, legally, correctly. We didn't tell anyone. We didn't announce it. Liam didn't want a party. He wanted to go to Swiss Chalet, which is his favorite restaurant, and he wanted to order a quarter chicken dinner with extra dipping sauce, and he wanted to come home and keep working on the next version of the app, which he had already started. That's what we did. I genuinely thought that our quiet would protect us. For about 5 months it did. The first sign was a comment on a local community Facebook page. Someone had shared a small article from a Northern Ontario business publication about the acquisition. The company had issued a press release, which I hadn't anticipated, and someone tagged Renata in it. I didn't see it right away. My neighbor, who has been my closest friend for 22 years, called me on a Tuesday morning and said, "Have you seen the Facebook thing?" I hadn't. She read it to me over the phone. I sat down at the kitchen table. I felt something cold settle in my chest. I told myself it probably wouldn't matter. I told myself Renata was in British Columbia, which was where she'd been living the last I'd heard, and she had her own life and she had made her choice 11 years ago, and surely she wouldn't. She called me on a Friday evening 3 weeks later. I hadn't heard her voice in over a decade. It was strange, the way it still sounded like her, like no time had passed at all in the voice, even though everything else had changed. She said, "Mom." I saw the article. I said, "I know." She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I didn't answer that. She said, "He's my son, Mom. I have a right to know what's happening in his life." Something moved in me then, not anger, something older than anger, something that had been sitting very still for 11 years and had just decided it was done being still. I said, "Renata, you haven't spoken to him in 11 years. She said, "It's complicated, Mom. You know it was complicated." I said, "Good night, Renata," and I hung up. She called back twice. I didn't answer. 6 weeks later, I received a letter from a law firm in Vancouver. The letter was 2 pages long and full of language I had to read several times before I understood what it was saying. The short version was this. Renata was asserting that as Liam's biological mother, she had a legal and financial interest in any earnings generated by her minor child. She was claiming that the acquisition proceeds should be partially, and the letter used the word substantially, directed to her as his parent under the terms of a parental entitlement argument that her lawyer had constructed with some care. My hands were shaking by the time I finished reading it. I'm not ashamed to say that. I called the family law lawyer in Sudbury who had handled my guardianship application 11 years earlier. She had retired. Her former colleague took my call, listened to me, read the key sections of the letter aloud, and said she would need to see the full document and review the guardianship order before she could advise me properly, but that my situation was defensible. Defensible. That was the word she used. Solid, not guaranteed. Defensible. I hung up and sat in my kitchen for a long time. The garden outside was just starting to come back. It was May. The tulips my husband had planted along the fence were up, orange and yellow, and I sat and looked at them and I thought about what it had cost me to get to this moment. Not just money. Time, my knees, which are not what they were, my sleep, which hasn't been right since I started managing Liam's night terrors when he was 5, the years of driving, the years of fighting, the years of sitting across from school boards and insurance companies and government agencies and being told that Liam's needs were too complex, too expensive, too much. Too much. I thought about all of it, and I thought, she does not get to come back now, I told Liam that evening. I sat down with him at the kitchen table. He was doing a logic puzzle. He always does logic puzzles after dinner, and I told him as plainly and calmly as I could that his mother had contacted me and that there was a legal situation I needed to sort out, and that I didn't want him to worry because I was handling it. He put the puzzle down. He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "Is she trying to take my money?" I said, "She is making a legal argument. My lawyer is going to respond to it." He said, "The guardianship order I've read specifies that you have full legal and financial decision-making authority for me until I turn 19. I looked it up when I was 13. I've kept a copy." I stared at him. He said, "I also saved every text message and voicemail and email she ever sent us, all 4 of them. I started saving them in 2017 in case they were ever needed. I have them in a folder." I didn't know what to say. I genuinely did not know what to say. He looked at me very steadily and said, "Grandma, she left, you stayed. That's a fact, and facts don't change." And then he picked up his logic puzzle and went back to it. My lawyer reviewed everything, the guardianship order, the trust documents, the acquisition paperwork, the timeline of Renata's absence, and came back to me 2 weeks later with her assessment. She said the case was stronger than she'd initially thought. The guardianship order was clear. The trust structure was sound. Renata had signed away her parental rights in practice, if not formally on paper, and her 11-year absence, no documented, verifiable, significantly undermined any argument about active parental involvement. But she also said it will still cost you. It will cost you time and it will cost you money, and there is always some uncertainty in family court. I said, "What do I do?" She said, "You let me respond. We document, and you don't panic." I tried not to panic. Renata's lawyer requested a mediation session. My lawyer advised me to attend. We drove down to a mediation office in Toronto in September. Renata was already in the room when we arrived. I hadn't seen her in 11 years. She looked like herself but flattened somehow, like a photograph of herself rather than the real thing. She looked at me when I sat down. She didn't look at Liam, who had insisted on attending and who sat to my left in a gray hoodie with his hands folded on the table, watching everything. Her lawyer spoke for a long time. He was very good, measured, articulate, making the argument sound almost reasonable. He talked about parental bonds and biological connections and a child's financial interests. He talked about the role of a natural parent in ways that made 11 years of absence sound like a minor interruption rather than what it actually was. When he finished, there was a silence. Liam said, "May I speak?" The mediator looked at my lawyer. My lawyer nodded. Renata's lawyer said, "This is somewhat irregular." Liam said, "I have documentation." He opened a folder he had brought. Inside was a printed timeline, 11 years, month by month, with notations, school events, medical appointments, therapy sessions, emergency room visits, every one of them attended by me and not by his mother. Alongside it was a printed copy of the 4 communications Renata had sent over 11 years. 4. He had printed the timestamps. He said very quietly, "I want to read something." No one stopped him. He read from a letter he had written. He read it in the flat, clear, precise way that Liam reads everything. No performance, no drama, just the words exactly as they were. He talked about what it meant to be 4 years old and not understand where your mother had gone. He talked about learning that he was autistic and what that had meant for him and who had been there for each part of it. He talked about the app, not the money, but the work, the years of work. He said, "The value of this application was generated entirely through my own effort and through the support of my grandmother, who has been my primary caregiver, my legal guardian, and the only constant in my life. I do not believe that biological connection entitles someone to benefit from work they had no part in. That is my position." He closed the folder. He put his hands back on the table. The room was very quiet. Renata was looking at him now. It was the first time she'd looked at him directly since we walked in. Her expression was something I couldn't entirely name. Not guilt, exactly. Or not only guilt. Something more complicated. Something that might in another life have been the beginning of something better. Her lawyer asked for a short break. During the break, my lawyer leaned over and said quietly to me, "I think they're going to withdraw." They did. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from Renata's lawyer confirming that the claim was being withdrawn. No further action would be pursued. I stood in my front hallway and read that letter 3 times. Then I went to the kitchen and made tea and sat by the window and looked at the garden, which was brown and finished for the season. By then, the tulip beds covered with mulch to wait for spring. Liam came downstairs. He poured himself a glass of water. He stood at the counter. I said, "It's over." He said, "I know. I saw the letter." I said, "Are you all right?" He thought about this in the careful way he thinks about everything. Then he said, "I feel mostly relief, with some residual sadness about the situation as a whole, but predominantly relief." I said, "Me too." He nodded. He drank his water. He said, "I'm going to keep working on version 2. There are some calibration issues with the pattern recognition module that I want to fix before the new year." I said, "Okay." He said, "Thank you, Grandma, for everything, the whole time." He didn't say it with tears. He didn't say it dramatically. He said it the way Liam says everything important, plainly, precisely, like a fact he wanted to make sure was in the record. I waited until he went back upstairs. Then I let myself cry just a little at my kitchen table with my tea going cold in front of me and the November wind coming off the lake outside and the empty garden waiting for spring. 11 years. Not one moment of it wasted. Not one moment of it something I would take back. He's going to be all right. He was always going to be all right. It just took the world a little time to catch up to what I already knew.